Johnny Carson knew everything. For 30 years, Hollywood's brightest stars sat across from him, smiling, charming, selling their carefully polished images to America. But Carson also saw what no one else did. The lies, the cruelty, the scandals that never made the papers. And behind that famous sly grin, Carson was keeping score. In private, he spoke of legends who weren't just difficult, they were dangerous. Some berated young assistants until they broke down in tears. Some used power and intimidation like weapons. Others carried secrets so disturbing that Carson refused to say their names in public, whispering only to close friends in his later years. These weren't rumors, they were the scandals Johnny Carson took to the grave. So the question is, when you look back at the golden age of Hollywood, its icons, its glamour, its untouchable stars, will you still see legends or monsters hiding in plain sight? Today, we're uncovering the scandals Johnny Carson could never fully expose until now. Johnny Carson, the gatekeeper of Hollywood's secrets. For 3 decades, Johnny Carson wasn't just America's late-night host. He was the silent gatekeeper of Hollywood's golden era. The man every star had to charm if they wanted to stay in America's good graces. To viewers, Carson's laugh was warm, his banter effortless, but off-camera he was sharper, colder, and endlessly observant. According to producers and staff who worked closely with him, Carson kept a private list of stars he despised. Not because they were quirky or egotistical, every star had that. These were the ones he considered rotten at the core. He once whispered to Ed McMahon during a commercial break, "That person should never be near a camera or a child." And the truth is, Carson was rarely wrong. Many of the names on his mental blacklist later had their darkest scandals exposed to the world. Others, their sins remain buried, known only to Carson himself, and a handful of insiders who dared to repeat his stories after his death. Scandal Den 1, Joan Crawford, the Queen, with ice in her veins. When Joan Crawford appeared on The Tonight Show in 1970, audiences thought they were watching Hollywood royalty, elegant posture, dazzling smiles, and that unmistakable voice. But Carson, he saw something different, something darker. Backstage, Crawford reportedly unleashed one of the most vicious tirades in the show's history. When a 20-year-old production assistant nervously entered her dressing room with the wrong glass of water, Crawford erupted. Witnesses said she called the young woman brainless and suggested she'd be better suited to a brothel than television. The assistant fled in tears. Crawford then demanded she be fired. Carson, usually detached and diplomatic, was furious. He played the professional on air, but afterward told his producer, "I've interviewed corpses with more personality, and none of them were this cruel." When Christina Crawford's memoir Mommy Dearest later revealed shocking allegations of abuse inside the Crawford home, Carson reportedly just nodded and said, "I believe every word. I saw who she really was in those few hours." Scandal Den 2, Frank Sinatra, the charming bully Carson couldn't stand. On screen, Johnny Carson and Frank Sinatra looked like old pals. The crooner would crack jokes, tell colorful stories, maybe even sing a line or two while Carson leaned back with his signature grin. But off-camera, Carson saw through the charm, and he didn't like what he saw. Carson respected Sinatra's talent, but he hated how the star used power like a weapon. If he didn't sing, he'd be a mob enforcer, Carson once told a close friend. And sometimes, I think he was both. Whenever Sinatra appeared on The Tonight Show, the atmosphere changed. He didn't arrive alone. He brought an entourage of men who looked less like assistants and more like bodyguards. They'd spread through the studio, watching everyone, making crew members feel like they were under surveillance. One incident cemented Carson's disdain. During a taping in the early 1970s, a floor manager gave Sinatra the standard 3-minute warning before his segment. Sinatra grabbed the man by his tie, yanked him close, and growled, "Nobody tells me when I've got 3 minutes. I'll go on when I'm ready." The manager, a Korean War veteran, was left shaking. Carson saw it on the monitor in his office. He nearly canceled the segment on the spot, but producers reminded him. Sinatra meant ratings. Carson went on with the show, but never forgot the moment. His dislike grew when Sinatra made a crude comment about a female staffer during a commercial break. For once, Carson broke his professional cool, staring Sinatra down and saying coldly, "We don't talk about my staff that way here." The cameras came back, both men put on their masks, and the audience never knew. But afterward, Carson made a rare demand: limit him to once a year. For a host who almost never interfered with bookings, this was extraordinary. It showed just how much Sinatra's bullying disgusted him. Scandal Den 3, Orson Welles, the genius who thought rules didn't apply. When Orson Welles sat on Johnny Carson's couch, audiences at home saw brilliant, the booming voice, the mesmerizing stories, the presence of a man who gave the world Citizen Kane. To viewers, he was a genius. To Carson and his staff, he was a nightmare. The trouble began long before the red light of the camera came on. Welles dismissed every single question Carson's writers prepared. One staffer recalled, he crossed out the entire sheet and handed it back blank. He told us our questions were pedestrian and obvious. That meant Carson had to improvise interviews with one of the most unpredictable men in Hollywood. It didn't stop there. Welles believed time limits didn't apply to him. If he was given 7 minutes, he'd take 20. Carson had subtle signals to wrap up a segment, tapping his pencil, shifting in his seat, but Welles ignored them all. On one occasion, he went on so long that 2 other guests were bumped entirely. And it wasn't just the talking. Welles treated The Tonight Show like it was his personal stage. He brought props without warning, derailed topics mid-conversation, even tried directing the cameraman from his seat. One stunned producer recalled, "He actually stood up and told our operators which angles to shoot." Johnny was livid. The staff didn't fare any better. Welles refused to speak to assistants directly, instead referring to them as the girl or the boy. Carson, a perfectionist about television etiquette, saw it as sheer arrogance. After one especially difficult taping, he turned to Ed McMahon and muttered, "Genius doesn't excuse everything." In public, Carson praised Welles's talent. Privately, he saw him as a cautionary tale, a man whose towering ego had consumed the genius underneath. Scandal Den 4, Bette Davis, Hollywood's queen of verbal violence. To the public, Bette Davis was a legend, 2-time Oscar winner, sharp-witted, and endlessly fascinating. When she appeared on The Tonight Show, audiences saw an aging but glamorous star who could deliver a story with punch and poise. Johnny Carson saw something else entirely. Behind the curtain, Davis was unpredictable, volatile, and at times downright cruel. Crew members braced themselves when she was booked. One assistant described her like this: "She didn't just talk, she cross-examined. You felt like you were on trial." Her sharp tongue first showed itself with other guests. If someone else on the couch was getting laughs, especially a younger actress, Davis would cut them off mid-sentence, turn her back, or fire off a sarcastic jab that left the room icy. She hated being upstaged, and she made sure no one forgot who the star was. Off camera, it got worse. Davis reportedly demanded whiskey in her dressing room before going on, and after a few sips, her words could turn ugly. Female staffers recalled her throwing out sexist and even racist remarks that shocked people, even by the looser standards of the. One makeup artist quit mid-prep after Davis sneered at her shaking hands and accused her of being a drunk. Carson, who normally avoided confrontation, reached his breaking point when Davis berated a cue card holder during rehearsal. He quietly stepped in and told her, "Miss Davis, on this show we speak to everyone with respect, or we don't speak at all." To everyone's surprise, she backed down. For a moment, even the great Bette Davis was stunned into silence. Carson respected her talent, but after her last appearance, he was done. He reportedly told his producer, "Life's too short to be flogged by Bette Davis, no matter how many Oscars she had." Scandal Den 5, Mickey Rooney, the aging child star with wandering hands. Mickey Rooney was once Hollywood royalty. In the late 1930s and early 40s, he was the biggest box office draw in the world, a child star who grew into a living symbol of the golden age. By the time he sat across from Johnny Carson, though, his legacy was tarnished and his behavior only made things worse. On The Tonight Show, Rooney's appearances should have been nostalgic tributes to his legendary career. Instead, they were infamous for two things: chaos and creeping discomfort. Crew members dreaded his visits. According to female staff, Rooney was notorious for crossing boundaries. He would grab a young assistant's hand and hold it too long, pull women closer while making suggestive remarks, or ask personal questions that had nothing to do with professionalism. It was like he thought being short gave him license to get away with anything, Carson once muttered after a particularly bad taping. Even worse, Rooney often showed up appearing intoxicated. On at least 3 occasions, staff recalled him slurring his words and forgetting stories mid-sentence. During one segment in 1977, he launched into a rambling anecdote about Judy Garland that quickly veered into inappropriate territory, forcing Carson to cut him off on live TV. During the break, Johnny turned to his producer and asked, "Is he drunk, or is this just who he is now?" What really disturbed Carson wasn't just Rooney's antics, but his confusion about why people were upset. He seemed genuinely unaware that his comments and touches were unacceptable. That generational gap, what Rooney thought was harmless fun, left staff shaken and Carson furious. After one appearance where Rooney made repeated remarks about a young actress also booked on the show, Carson personally apologized to her after taping. A producer recalled, "I've never seen Johnny so embarrassed. He promised it wouldn't happen again." True to his word, Rooney's bookings became rare. By the late 70s, Carson insisted that any Rooney appearance be taped during the day, with stricter controls in place. Rooney was once America's golden boy, but to Carson, he had become a sad reminder of how fame, unchecked, can twist into something ugly. Scandal Zen 6. Zsa Zsa Gabor, the diva who drove Carson to despair. Zsa Zsa Gabor was everything late-night television loved. Glamorous, flamboyant, and endlessly quotable. With her heavy Hungarian accent and larger-than-life persona, she seemed born for Johnny Carson's couch. Audiences adored her. But behind the curtain, she was one of the most exhausting, demanding guests The Tonight Show staff ever dealt with. Carson once quipped after a taping, "I'd rather interview a cat. At least the cat wouldn't need 3 assistants and special lighting." Her diva behavior began long before she even entered the studio. Every appearance came with a list of demands. Her dressing room had to be kept at exactly 74 degrees, fresh orchids only, never carnations. A chilled bottle of Perrier with exactly 3 ice cubes, and, most outrageous of all, no other female guests under 40 allowed on the same show. A producer later admitted, her writer read like a parody. "The first time we saw it, we thought it was a joke, but it wasn't." If her exacting standards weren't met, Zsa Zsa would simply refuse to leave her dressing room, sometimes holding up taping for nearly an hour. One infamous incident occurred when she discovered the makeup department didn't have her preferred brand of foundation. She erupted into a shouting match with the head artist, demanding someone drive to Beverly Hills immediately to fetch it. The taping was minutes away from being canceled until Carson himself called her, "Zsa honey, you look beautiful already, we have a show to do, save the cosmetics emergency for another day." And then there was her treatment of staff. To Carson, it wasn't just her diva requests, it was the way she dismissed the people working hard behind the scenes. Producers, assistants, even camera operators were beneath her notice. She'd wave them off like servants while turning on charm for Johnny and the camera. Despite her outrageous behavior, Carson kept booking her. Why? Because she delivered. Once on stage, Zsa Zsa was funny, glamorous, and unpredictable, a walking headline in diamonds and designer gown. But when the show wrapped, Carson would often mutter to his team, "Next time she wants to be on, tell her we've renamed it The Tonight Show starring Zsa Zsa Gabor. I'll be her sidekick." She might have dazzled America, but behind the smiles and jewels, Carson saw the truth. Zsa Zsa wasn't there to share the stage, she was there to own it, no matter the cost. Scandal Zen 7. Shelley Winters. The powder keg. Carson couldn't control. Shelley Winters was a 2-time Oscar winner, a woman who had shared the screen with legends like James Dean and Paul Newman. On paper, she was a dream guest for The Tonight Show. Accomplished, witty, and bursting with Hollywood stories. But to Carson and his crew, she was something else entirely, a live grenade that could go off at any moment. Carson once joked after an appearance, Shelley doesn't talk. She detonates. The problem wasn't just what she said, it was how unpredictable she was. Winters had a habit of hijacking interviews, turning a light-hearted late-night chat into a fiery sermon. Ask her about a movie role, and she might launch into a 5-minute rant about government corruption. Try to steer the conversation back and she'd double down. As one director recalled, with Shelley it was like trying to steer a tornado. All Johnny could do was wait for her to burn herself out. And then there were her outbursts. Winters had a temper, and everyone in the industry knew it. On one British talk show, she famously threw a glass of whiskey in Oliver Reed's face after he made a sexist remark. That reputation made Carson's team nervous every time she was booked. Stage managers admitted they would actually child-proof the set before she came on, removing glasses, ashtrays, even paperweights, just in case she felt the urge to throw something. But it wasn't just the volatility, it was the way Winters steamrolled everyone around her. If another guest started telling a funny story, Shelley might interrupt, roll her eyes or talk over them until the spotlight swung back in her direction. She wasn't cruel for the sake of cruelty, but her need to dominate a conversation made for tense moments on live television. Carson respected her talent, he couldn't deny that. But after one particularly fiery appearance where Winters turned a simple question into a rant about the Vietnam War, Johnny sighed to his producer, "I may not want to vacation with her, but at least she means every word she said." That, in the end, was what separated Winters from some of Carson's most despised guests. She wasn't manipulative or calculating, she wasn't cruel to the staff. She was just uncontrollable. Passionate to the point of self-destruction, authentic but exhausted. And for a host who prided himself on being the calm center of late-night chaos, Shelley Winters was the one storm he never figured out how to contain. Scandal Zen 8. Jane Russell. The star whose politics Carson couldn't stomach. Jane Russell was one of Hollywood's most iconic sex symbols of the 1940s and 50s, the smoldering brunette who lit up the screen in The Outlaw and held her own alongside Marilyn Monroe in Gentlemen Prefer Blonde. To the public, she was beauty, charm, and star power personified, but to Johnny Carson, Jane Russell represented something far more troubling: intolerance that had no place on his stage. Carson prided himself on keeping The Tonight Show relatively neutral. He let guests talk politics if they wanted, but his guiding principle was simple: treat everyone with respect. Russell, however, reportedly crossed that line more than once. According to staff accounts, her problems weren't with Johnny, they were with his crew. Multiple witnesses recalled her making disparaging remarks about LGBTQ+ employees working behind the scenes. During one taping in the early 1970s, she allegedly refused to let a gay makeup artist touch her, demanding a replacement. Another time, she reportedly told the booking team she would not appear on the same episode as Rock Hudson, making crude remarks about his sexuality, which, though not public at the time, was no secret within Hollywood circles. For Carson, that was unforgivable. He had many friends in the gay community, including loyal staff who had been with him for years. According to one producer, Johnny was ahead of his time. He didn't tolerate discrimination on his show, not from anyone, no matter how famous. Russell also made headlines for her increasingly extreme political views. During one commercial break, she was overheard dismissing civil rights legislation in a way that shocked crew members. Word of her comments reached Carson, who quietly but firmly decided he'd had enough. After a handful of appearances in the early 70s, Jane Russell was quietly dropped from the booking roster. It was one of the rare times Johnny exercised a personal veto over a guest, and the message was clear. He could forgive diva behavior, he could forgive eccentricity, but what he wouldn't forgive was cruelty disguised as conviction. Jane Russell remained a Hollywood icon to the public, but in Carson's private ledger, she was a name written in bold, not welcome back. Scandal Zen 9. Jerry Lewis. The comedian Carson called truly hateful. Jerry Lewis was a legend, a comedian, actor, director, and humanitarian who raised billions for muscular dystrophy research through his annual telethon. To millions of Americans, he was the clown prince of comedy, a tireless performer who seemed to embody generosity and energy. But Johnny Carson saw a very different side of Lewis, one that left him not just unimpressed,
but deeply disturbed. Carson could tolerate he could tolerate eccentricity. What he couldn't stomach was cruelty. And according to numerous staff accounts, Lewis had cruelty in spades. On air, he was manic, funny, and unpredictable. Off air, he was cutting, dismissive, and openly demeaning. One producer remembered, "Jerry didn't just talk over Johnny, he hijacked the whole show." In one infamous appearance, Lewis repeatedly interrupted other guests, dominated every segment, and even reached across the desk to adjust Carson's tie, a massive violation of Carson's well-known personal boundaries. Johnny hated anyone touching him without permission. Lewis knew that, and did it anyway. It wasn't a gag, it was a power play. But what infuriated Carson the most was Lewis's treatment of crew. He refused to learn staffers' names, calling them camera guy or makeup girl. During a rehearsal, when a cameraman coughed quietly, a man who it turned out had allergies, Lewis stopped everything and launched into a tirade. "You breathe like an amateur. Get him out of here." The room went silent. Carson, usually reserved when it came to scolding guests, was visibly furious. The hypocrisy cut even deeper. Lewis would cry on live television about helping sick children, then come to The Tonight Show and berate people who couldn't fight back. Carson, who valued authenticity above all else, reportedly told Ed McMahon after one appearance, "He's what happens when ego outruns talent." In a town full of phonies, Jerry Lewis still stands out, and not in a good way. After the early 1980s, Carson quietly banned Lewis from ever appearing on The Tonight Show again. Few guests were blacklisted outright, but Lewis earned the dishonor. Years later, at a private dinner, Carson was asked about Lewis one last time. His response was unusually harsh for a man who rarely spoke ill of anyone, truly hateful. That's who he was. For Johnny Carson, who had interviewed thousands of stars and navigated countless egos, that was perhaps the ultimate condemnation. What Johnny Carson's blacklist really reveals. For 3 decades, Johnny Carson was America's nightcap. He sat behind the desk with that sly smile, asking questions that seemed casual but always cut deeper than expected. To the public, he was the charming host who could make anyone shine. But behind the curtain, Carson saw through every mask Hollywood tried to sell. Joan Crawford's icy cruelty, Frank Sinatra's bullying power, Orson Welles's unchecked ego, Bette Davis's verbal attacks, Mickey Rooney's disturbing behavior, Zsa Zsa Gabor's outrageous diva demand, Shelley Winters' volatile unpredictability, Jane Russell's venomous prejudice, and Jerry Lewis's sheer cruelty. 9 stars who, in Carson's eyes, weren't just difficult, they were dangerous to the people around them. The truth is, Carson never set out to destroy reputation. He wasn't a gossip, he wasn't a tabloid. He wanted the show to run smoothly. But when someone treated staff like dirt, when they abused their fame, when they wore masks so convincing that audiences would never suspect the darkness underneath, Carson remembered, and he never forget. His private blacklist isn't just about Hollywood's golden age, it's a reminder that fame has always been a shield, one that can hide abuse, ego, prejudice, and cruelty. Today, one cell phone clip can end a career over. But in Carson's time, the studios and networks protected their stars at all costs. Without Johnny's quiet disgust, the public might never have known who these icons really were. As one of his producers later said, "The camera doesn't just add 10 pounds, it adds a layer of fiction." Johnny could see through that fiction better than anyone. And that may be his most enduring legacy. Not just the jokes, not just the interviews, but the ability to look past the spotlight and see who people really were when no one was watching. If this deep dive gave you a new perspective on Johnny Carson and the golden age stars he despised, let us know in the comments below. Which revelation shocked you most? And don't forget, hit like, subscribe, and tap the bell because our next video exposes another Hollywood secret that's even darker, the 1980s sitcom where producers installed panic buttons on set because of one child star's violent outbursts. Trust me, you won't want to miss them.